Good boy.
Welcome, everyone, to Doc Dog and Disabilities. I have a guest today, Opal. She has her own podcast that she does. So, Opal, why don't you say a little bit about that?
Hi, everyone. My name is Opal Otenburg. I'm a first-year PhD student at Stanford University in the Earth System Science program. And then I'm also a podcast host for a show called Inclusivity. And on that show, I bring scientists from all fields and walks of life on and just to tell their story. And I'm hoping that brings some representation and belonging to the listeners. And on top of my responsibilities, I also have a couple invisible disabilities that impact my everyday life and my life as a scientist.
When I stumbled upon your podcast, I was like, hey, that's like perfect. It's basically exactly what I'm doing just on podcast instead of video. What challenges or barriers have you experienced either in school or in your career since you were diagnosed?
Yeah, so I have a couple invisible disabilities. Like I said, I have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and POTS, Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia syndrome, which I always struggle to say. What challenges and barriers have I faced because of that? I fortunately haven't faced a ton of barriers, but I have faced a lot of challenges. My PTSD really impacted my ability to focus. The way that I describe it in a way that I think people can understand is like when you're on like a really important Zoom meeting and then your Wi-Fi cuts out and you're like desperately trying to get back online. I feel like that's how it works in my brain, where it just like goes offline. I'm like desperately trying to get back in. That can, as you can imagine, could be incredibly impactful to my schooling, especially in undergrad. I would spend like hours just like staring at a screen and like trying to focus and really struggling to do so. Since then, I've had a lot of healing, a lot of therapy, and I've built up a lot of strategies to help with it. So it's less impactful now. But in 2022, after I had COVID, I developed POTS. I've made a lot of progress with PTSD. I was like, oh, shoot. Okay, here comes another something. With POTS, it can be, well, I guess maybe I should explain POTS for folks who don't know it, because PTSD is a lot more explained in media than POTS is. Your symptoms come and go based on your posture. So that's the postural part of it. Like when you're standing, you often can have really high heart rates, which can come with a multitude of symptoms like headaches, nausea, lightheadedness, dizziness. Some people faint. So that side of things can be incredibly difficult when you're a laboratory worker, because for me, I was standing almost all of the time in the lab, and I had to learn how to do everything sitting, which luckily I was able to do most things sitting. And then the things that I couldn't do, I basically would just have a quite flexible schedule. So when I was having a good day, I would do those things that required standing. And then when I was having a bad day, I would do like my computer work where I could just sit at my desk all day. So that's kind of how I adjusted for that. There was a lot of challenges that came with it, but fortunately I didn't face a ton of barriers, at least like when you think about barriers with like administration and whatnot.
Right. That's great. It's always good when your work or the school is actually supportive. Like
yes.
They're supposed to be.
Yeah, because I've heard so many horror stories, and yeah, fortunately my school and work has been quite helpful on that front.
That's awesome. So how long ago did you get diagnosed with the POTS?
So I was diagnosed with POTS actually in January of this year, and it took a while to get diagnosed. I know some people have heard the average is like 7 years from onset of symptoms to diagnosis, and for me, I think it was just over a year. So I think I had it lucky, but it felt like forever in the process of getting a diagnosis. Felt so terrible.
Yeah.
But
I can understand that for sure. I actually got diagnosed myself with POTS recently in the last couple months. So
wow.
Yeah, it's been an interesting ride for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is so frustrating, like, because I mean, when you have symptoms and nobody knows why, and you go to the doctor and they're like, there's nothing on nothing is showing up on MRI and like all the tests that they do, but it's like, well, but the symptoms are there. I'm not lying.
Yep.
Like I feel them. So what's the problem.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's especially hard if you have any like anxiety disorders on your chart too, because
Mm.
anxiety disorders and POTS do share some symptoms. So I had a lot of time of like trying to really convince my doctors to be like, okay, this is not a normal anxiety symptom. Like anxiety symptoms aren't just felt when I'm standing up, you know? So it took a while to really get it through their heads. But yeah, I'm thankful that I have the diagnosis and answers now.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm just kind of interested in that too, because I feel like anxiety and POTS happen together a lot. Like they
Yeah.
already have anxiety, and it's like the same for fibromyalgia. I wonder if there's like some kind of when you have predisposed to like anxious, you're usually like you're feeling things a lot deeper and just your body is more alert. So maybe
Yeah.
it can predispose you to that. So you
Yeah.
had COVID, and that's I've heard that that is one of the things that can cause it as well. So
Years after COVID bout.
it wasn't, I don't think it was COVID.
Okay.
I did have a sickness before it
Yeah.
happened, but I don't think, I didn't really get tested for COVID. I just stayed home. So
Mhm.
it's possible. It's very possible.
Yeah. I've heard all sorts of things. Like I knew some person who got POTS after having like severe concussions. So seems to be like
Yeah.
all these random things that can
Yeah. The
bring it
human
on.
body and the mind are just bizarre.
Yeah. I agree.
What was it like to suddenly, have these symptoms and have to ask for accommodations or change, the way that you did things? Like you said, you would sit down and do your computer work, and when you had a good day, you would do the standing up things. What was that like for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that asking for accommodations when you've never had to before is an incredibly daunting task. At least it was for me, especially because I've always been quite an independent person. And I've also always been someone that kind of didn't want to ask for help ever. Because of that, it was incredibly difficult to ask for accommodations, even when it was something that was obviously needed. If you have an invisible disability, that can add some more complexities there because whoever you're asking for just has to trust you, like just has to think that you're being honest and that these are actual experience symptoms because they're not really seeing it with their own eyes, like it's pretty easy to look normal when you have POTS, even if you're feeling absolutely terrible. And then on top of the invisible disability aspect, there was the aspect of POTS for a lot of people is a dynamic disability. So, like for me, during my period when I'm menstruating, it can be like 10 times worse. But then if it's like a good week of the month, then I'll almost be able to like forget that I have POTS, for like about like a week, a month. It'll be like totally good. And so it's a really strange thing to ask for these accommodations when they're changing. You don't need them all the time. Because of that, it felt difficult to feel justified to ask for those things. When usually when I would see accommodations, like just in media or like when my friends had accommodations in college or whatnot, it was like a constant need. Like for my friend who had ADHD, I think he had like time and a half in exams, and he always used that. For me, like I also have time and a half on exams, but it's on an as needed basis because I don't need it all the time. But sometimes with things like PTSD, then I'll have like a foggy day or whatever, and I'll need it that day, but I won't need it the next. So that made it really, really difficult. But I think the way I kind of eased into it was just like, firstly, just following my like treatment plans for myself. So, which sounds kind of, I don't know, kind of dumb to be like, oh, first I just like took care of myself. But that's true. Like, first I started by just making sure I was doing the things like getting a ton of water because that's really helpful for POTS, or making sure I had enough salt and wearing my compression socks and whatnot. And doing that on like an everyday life, and then having the people around me not find that strange, I guess. was like my first entrance into like, okay, how can I advocate for myself? After that, I would ask those safe people, like my partner, my best friend, my therapist, for like small asks for help and things I needed. And then eventually that got brought to like, okay, I would ask my therapist if I could bring my ESA to therapy sessions. And that was like a bigger ask in my brain. Through that whole process of asking safe people, I eventually felt safe enough to ask my like, disability services. And now I actually officially have accommodations for the first time, which was like a huge win in my book because I remember in undergrad that was like something that was suggested to me a lot and I was very resistant towards it. And overall, I think it's really difficult to ask for accommodations. And I totally understand that, at least for myself, I needed to take like baby steps before I got to the place where I could ask for official accommodations.
There's a few things that came to mind when you were talking. One is that, especially as women going into like a STEM career, you like one thing, you're usually like type A,
Yeah.
right? And another thing is in society, we're almost like told not to want or not to ask for things for ourselves.
Yeah.
We're supposed to, nurture everyone else, right?
Mhm.
And I think it becomes very easy to internally feel that and feel like, oh, I can't do that because I don't need it all the time. So why would I, ask for the accommodations? On the other side, too, like with the people who do see you on your good days and then see you on your bad days, they're like, you could be doing, flips one day, like
Yeah.
not that you necessarily do, but you could. And
Mhm.
then like the next day you can't like barely stand,
Yep.
right? So I think that I do understand that on the outside, like it could just look very bizarre.
Yep.
But hopefully, and I feel like things are getting better for disability and thinking more towards, I guess, just being more aware. I think that it is getting that way, but there is still that stigma or especially with invisible disabilities and mental health, which
Mhm.
is also an invisible disability.
Yeah.
It's hard for the person outside your body to understand because they don't feel what you feel. They're not inside your brain, right? It's a difficult thing, but I'm very glad you're able to get past that initial fears.
Yeah. It's still one of those things where it waxes and wanes on my comfort level with it. But yeah, I'm also happy that at least I have like official accommodations in place now. And I do agree that I think it partially is because, yeah, we're women. And then in STEM, that adds another element to it. And because I'm in the earth sciences field, that can often be more like field work, like let's go out into the middle of the desert sort of thing. So it has some pride in like hard work. So I think that's also part of it is like the physical labor side of things is often encouraged, which is great sometimes, but that's not often accessible to everyone, obviously.
Yeah. And being a woman in a science career, it's like it feels like a double whammy because it's almost like you want to prove that, we belong there, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just, people still have preconceptions about like what men and women should be doing, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Did anyone treat you differently once you disclose your disability to them?
I think fortunately not yet. But I think I've gotten very lucky about that. I also think I am quite careful to discuss my disabilities with certain people. I pretty much only disclose it to people that I am comfortable with, or things like my podcast or this type of platform where I think that people would benefit from that disclosure. So it's worth it to me if they don't believe me. But that being said, fortunately, the people that I have disclosed it to, I've never had a bad experience with it. I think a lot of my loved ones were with me through like the entire process of getting a POTS diagnosis, which I think was helpful. So then they understood that they were with me through every step of the way, like at my doctor's appointments and whatnot. So they were just thankful that I had a diagnosis finally. I do remember that like my best friend, after I told him that I had PTSD, like months later, he reacted really well when I told him. But months later, I remember he briefly mentioned that he had like no idea that people could get PTSD that weren't like combat veterans. And he like told me that he had to do like all this research afterwards, which is really kind that he was willing to do that. So I think even when people react really well, I think it's still like an adjustment for them because you're changing, but also like they have to change their like idea of you as well, which makes sense. So
Right, right. They have to
yeah.
change their concepts or, that's very sweet that he went and,
Yeah.
researched it. Not a lot of people would be willing to do that. So
Yeah.
that's a good friend.
Yeah, yeah, he's great. But I did think it was funny because he like didn't indicate that at all when I had told him that he just didn't even think that people could get PTSD when they weren't combat veterans. So I was very surprised to find that out. And yeah, I felt very loved that he was willing to do that.
Yeah, it is kind of funny with me and my service dog. I can't tell you how many times people ask me if I'm either deaf or blind.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, there's other things the dog can do. But yes, it's just the, the main, general population, they only know the most common thing that people talk about, right?
Yeah. And what
Because
people see in media.
right, exactly. And so my next question is, what was the hardest adjustment that you had to make for yourself?
I honestly think the hardest thing, which sounds strange because it wasn't actually really related to the disabilities itself, but just that I had to adjust my expectations for myself. Like before, I had a quite quote unquote healthy body. Like I didn't really have to think about my body at all and how it worked. It just did what I wanted it to do, and that was it. So, and then afterwards, now that's kind of like a constant thought in my brain is like, oh, how will my body work tomorrow or how will it work the next day? And having to adjust my expectations to meet potential flare ups or whatnot. And I think that can be especially difficult, again, if you're in STEM, because a lot of us are very like high achieving people who are also have like quite extreme work ethics sometimes, which is not always good. And I'm not saying it's good, but it is like a characteristic that's often seen in STEM. So when you have a chronic illness and you can't always have that extreme work ethic or super high achieving, it can be hard to change that expectation in your head. But I honestly think the thing that helped me most was just having like a little bit of compassion about it and thinking about it as if like, okay, if my best friend was experiencing this or my partner was experiencing this, like I wouldn't think that they were being lazy or I wouldn't think that they didn't have a work ethic, but I would want them to take time for themselves and do the things that they need to feel better. Mm-hmm. And that was like one thing that helped me. But I do think it's still one of the hardest things about having a chronic illness and is still one of the things that catches me off guard about something that's very overwhelming sometimes is when you're like randomly in a flare up and you're like, oh shit, I have a project deadline, but now I have to like take care of myself.
Right. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. You get used to you, right?
Yeah.
And how much you can do and when you're healthy, right?
Yep.
And then now, especially since with POTS, it's so like varied and it comes on like just randomly. You can't predict it. You could be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go, visit my family tomorrow, but then
Yeah.
you wake up and you can't even get out of bed. It's very frustrating because you have to keep giving yourself that grace. The second thing I was thinking is we give other people all the doubt in the world, right? All the, I don't know what the word is, but
benefit of the doubt.
Benefit of the doubt, right?
Yeah.
But for ourselves, we're always our hardest critic, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting. But I like that. Just like keep reminding yourself that, okay, I'm not being lazy. I need to listen to my body today.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you ensure that you're doing adequate self-care? That is perfect for this next question, right?
Yep.
How do you ensure that you do adequate self-care and how has that changed since you were diagnosed?
Yes, again, I think listening to your body is of utmost importance. And I guess changing what my treatment, I guess, is for my body that day based on what my body feels. So, like for POTS, a lot of things that help, which I mentioned earlier, is a lot of water intake and a lot of salt intake. So, when I'm having like off days, if I listen to my body and I'm like, oh, I'm feeling a little shaky today, oh, I'm feeling a little bit more lightheaded than usual, just to up my salt intake some more that day. There's things like that that can be helpful to ensure that I'm doing it on a regular basis. I try to keep what I call like first aid kits in my backpack or my purse. And that can include things like electrolyte packets for salt intake, or things like I take medication as needed for POTS. So my propranolol to help with tachycardia, I'll keep some extra of that in my backpack and my purse. And then also things like, I don't know if you deal with temperature dysregulation with POTS, but
Yes.
for me, it's one of the worst symptoms.
Yeah.
Like, it always is so shocking to me how much just being too hot or being too cold can impact your life. So I will sometimes carry little like cold packs, like the ones you can just shake with me. So then if I ever am like really, really overwhelmingly hot, I can just use that on my wrist or whatnot to cool myself down, or my neck. And then I have the same thing for my PTSD, where I will keep things like gum or mints to try to get myself back in the moment, as well as like fidget toys to try to not leave the moment. So I'll keep things like that, or my journal if I need to like brain dump and just get whatever is in my head out of my head. So those are like a few things that ensure that I'm keeping up with that self-care when I'm like in science and I'm like out and about and on campus or whatnot. That allows me to make sure I'm still doing those things while in STEM.
Awesome. Yeah, that's actually really good advice. I need to do one of those.
It was super helpful. I didn't used to, and then when I started keeping it with me, it like really helped me maintain a more like stable baseline, especially with POTS.
What surprised you the most about your transition into having a disability and learning what accommodations you needed and how to take care of this new version of yourself?
I think that is again the just self-doubt surrounding an invisible disability and a dynamic disability was just like so incredibly overwhelming to me when I was going through it. I spent a long time trying to get this diagnosis. I spent a long time feeling like it was my fault and it wasn't actually reality, because that's kind of what my doctors were implying. It took me a long time to just really accept that what it was, I guess, and to also accept that I needed accommodations for it and I needed help with it. It being an invisible disability and it being a dynamic disability made that really hard to get over that doubt aspect of it. I often compare it to like imposter syndrome in science, where everyone around me was believing me, like all my loved ones were believing me. Same with like in imposter syndrome with science, all your coworkers believe you that you're going to be like this great scientist, but then you are struggling to actually believe it yourself. It was a similar thing for me. Everyone around me was believing me, but I was just really struggling to believe it myself. I think that was the part that was really surprising to me when I was like going through the diagnosis process. At that point, I like knew the treatment plan and everything, and I knew what my symptoms were, but I wasn't really thinking about the mental aspect of having a chronic illness. And I wasn't anticipating that whatsoever, honestly. So that was a big shock.
Yeah, again, we're our worst critics. Is there anything that you would do differently if you knew what you know now about your disability and taking care of yourself?
Yes, I think I would definitely treat myself with more compassion, because, like I said, when I was going into this, I was experiencing a lot of doubt from my doctors. So, and because of that, I was really pushing myself to act like life was regular despite having like debilitating symptoms. So I was really, really pushing myself, when if I just paced myself just the tiniest bit, I think I would have had a lot easier of a time, both mentally and physically. So I think treating myself with a little bit more compassion would be something I would change. And honestly, pushing my doctors a little bit more, or changing doctors would also have been helpful. But those are the two things. And those are honestly, yeah, that's what I would suggest to people if they had a similar experience of receiving a diagnosis, on like how I'd make it easier for them.
Yeah, just treat yourself with some compassion and pace yourself no matter
Yeah.
what the doctors tell you. Yeah, it's unfortunate that the doctors, like, if they can't see like a test result that, then they're like, there's nothing wrong with you. Or if they don't know it, they're like, whatever, it's just your anxiety. Like,
Yep.
it really shouldn't be like that in medicine. they should be more apt to want to help you and figure out what is wrong and not just assume that you're lying or,
Yeah.
that's crazy. Is there anything else that you want to say to our viewers?
One thing that I would say is that if you've newly developed a disability, is finding community is super, super helpful. And that doesn't have to be like an in-person community, although it could be. Like I'm doing my first disability community event at my university this Friday, which I'm really excited about. But also like people like disability advocates online, just like following a bunch of people, that was super helpful for me to just normalize the experience. And then apart from that, if you have access to therapy, that was also incredibly helpful. So those are two things that I'd like 100% recommend if you just developed a disability, and was so, so helpful for me.
Awesome. Hashtag subscribe to Opal's podcast. What's the podcast called?
It's called Inclusivity. It's INCLU, and then in parentheses is SCI because it's targeted towards scientists.
Awesome. I will put a link in the description below.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, maybe we'll do this again.
That'd be awesome.
All right.
Good boy.